First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's of course an honor to be here in the first conference of the society, and very happy to contribute from this corner of the planet in South America, from Chile to the discussion and the conference. What I want to share with you is this topic of consciousness, and particularly one of the arguments that has been under discussion between the enactive view of consciousness and the more traditional neurocentric or orthodox view of consciousness. Briefly, this is the organization of my presentation. First, I want to present the question under discussion in this debate. Then we're going to see what is the enactive answer to the question, which is the metaphysical hypothesis of enactivism about the substrates of consciousness. And then we're going to check the enactive argument to support the thesis, the invitation that they set for us. And then I'm going to try to show the criticism to this argument by presenting the explanatory framework of the opposite view, the traditional view, and in which way the enactive argument fails, so to speak, in the sense of not really challenging the explanatory framework of the traditional view. And finally, I'm going to try to propose a reformulation of the argument, or if you want to reformulate the message, the main message of the enactive view in different terms, and finally pass to the conclusions. Okay. Well, the question here, what is the question? It's basically a metaphysical question. Is this one, is consciousness all in the head, all in the brain, or is the body beyond the brain an essential part of the biological basis of consciousness? Does the body belong to the minimal realizing system for consciousness, or is the minimal realizing system for consciousness confined to the brain? So that's the question, that's the main question under discussion. And here we find two answers. Okay. One is they call the brain-bound. By brain-bound, you mean neurocentric, traditional neuroscience of consciousness. The internal disposition you can find, for example, in Bloch very, very neatly, but also in Prince or even in Clark, that are authors that come from more unembodied, but still remain brain-bound regarding consciousness. Versus, okay, the enactive view. And the enactive view is basically an embodied externalist view about consciousness. And then you have the authors that I mentioned here, but for the purposes of this analysis that I'm going to present here, I'm going to focus on one specific argument which is provided by Postman and Thompson in his publications, and is in my view, one of the most elaborated arguments to support the enactive view, which takes the explanatory level. Okay. Okay. What is the enactive answer to this question? The hypothesis. You can read it here. It's pretty clear, right? So the enactive hypothesis is that the minimal biological realizing system for creative consciousness is not the brain or some neural subsystem, but an organism, all understood as a self-sustaining system composed of some crucial set of dynamically entangled neuronal and extraneural subsystem. So the direct substrate of consciousness is the whole body, okay, the whole organism, and not just the brain. Now, in the discussion, the enactivists, they complain that the internalists misunderstand somehow the enactive position. Okay, in which sense? They say the internalists misunderstand the enactive position has a primary metaphysical thesis. They mean they want to clarify that the enactive hypothesis, this one that you are viewing here, which is metaphysical in character, okay? But they want to clarify that the hypothesis is derived from previous considerations about what consciousness is and how should be explained. So the point of an activist here is you shouldn't take our position as a immediately metaphysical commitment, but you have to understand that we arrived to this metaphysical hypothesis because given some explanatory analysis, okay, we are led finally to this position. Okay, so that's the point. And I think they are right about this. I think that's it's fair, the complaint, because indeed the internalists usually they overlook this previous steps, okay, in the enactive view. Okay, but then the discussion seemed to stop at some moment. I haven't seen really a reply to this from the internalists. Okay, so my motivation to do this analysis is just trying to contribute to the discussion, okay, and take this kind of complaint, take the challenge, and see what happens. Okay. So my replies is for the enactivist view is that this complaint is fair enough. So let's move. So let's go to the explanatory level. Let's analyze the explanatory frameworks behind the hypothesis. Okay. Okay. Now we are gonna get into some details about the enactive argument. Okay. So here they declare our aim is to persuade you to prefer enactive to brain-bound. Specifically, we'll argue that a strong case can be made for thinking that the biological system for creator consciousness isn't limited to the brain. I highlight this because it's important, I think, to see that the enactive invitation is to try to adjudicate. Okay, so it's this one or this other. It's to prefer one instead of the other. It's a kind of invitation to make a choice, okay, about one program, the traditional orthodox and the new enactive, more embodied program. Okay. What is the argument here? And Thompson and Cosmelly, the argument. If you organize the argument with this in these premises or conditionals, is something like this. Okay, first they say isolating the brain has the minimal realizing system for consciousness, as the brain-bound view usually does, requires two, that the brain and body are also separable as explanatory factors of consciousness. This is the explanatory level, okay? Which requires three, that the brain can be physiologically separated. They speak of unplugged. They use the term. Unplugged from the body while keeping all its capacities, including consciousness, working normally. Okay. So they offer these conditionals in the argument. And in the papers, these are two papers by Tom and Melly, they really do a very nice job with a lot of biological, physiological detail about how the brain is so deeply entangled with the body, with the endocrine system, with the immunological system, with all sorts of metabolic um, communications and dependencies with respect to the body. Very nice job, a lot of detail. And they offer this kind of consideration. They say internalized neural explanation requires explanatory separability. There is the point. Our argument proceeds by reconsidering the brain in a bath thought experiment. So they take the brain in a bath thought experiment and they say, well, if you really want to have a brain, if you really want to have a brain in a bath working normally with including consciousness, and they're going to say, well, finally you need a body. Finally, they say careful examination of this thought experiment indicates that any adequately functional vat would be a surrogate body. That the so-called vat would be not a vat at all, but rather an embodied agent in the world. What the thought experiment shows is that the brain and body are so deeply entangled that they are explanatory inseparable. Okay, so you cannot, according to them, you cannot separate them from the explanatory point of view. And so, say, we have good explanatory grounds, okay, for supporting that the minimal realizing system for consciousness includes the body and not just the brain. So here you see the explanatory ground to support the metaphysical hypothesis, okay, about the minimal realizing system for consciousness. Or something like this, right? You analyze the brain about thought experiment, this classical, right, image about the brain apart and being feeding by, let's say, a computer or whatever. But finally, you realize, analyzing the plausibility, the real possibility of doing this, that the bat has to be a kind of surrogate of a body. Finally, you need to reconstruct the body in a world. There's no other way to have a brain really functioning with, including consciousness. The whole point of the thought experiment is to remove the world and the body while preserving brain function. Yet, to get the brain to be a brain in the right way, we have to give it a body in a world. So that's the conclusion. You cannot separate, okay? So there is something here that is right, I think is well taken, but it's an inferential step, I think, that doesn't follow. I'm gonna try to explain here. But before that, let's read a brief recap, okay? So we were invited at the beginning to analyze the explanatory grounds, okay? Of the metaphysical hypothesis to adjudicate between the brain-bound and enactive approaches to consciousness. Okay? So it's an invitation to make a choice. Either you follow the traditional neurocentric view, brain-bound, or to take the enactive path. Internal narrow explanation favors brain-bound, okay, whereas embodied wide explanation favors enactive. That's the game. And then the next step is showing that internal explanation requires explanatory separability between neural and bodily factors, which in turn requires unpluggability between them. Those are the conditionals that we saw, and then perform the analysis of the brain about thought experiment the conclusion is that the examination of the brain lab strongly suggests that neural factors aren't unpluggable from the bodily factors, and thus that the two are explanatory inseparable. So you fail with one of the conditionals, right? The main moral of our examination of the brain lab is that brain states can't be unplugged from the body state, so internalist explanation isn't a good framework for the neuroscience of consciousness. Okay, we shouldn't follow this framework. It's not a good one. We should prefer enactive to brain-bound. So we should just abandon traditional neuroscience of consciousness, and they have in mind specifically the program of the neural correlates of consciousness. Okay, trying to find neural correlates. It's not going to work. We should move to the more enactive, embodied externalist research program. Okay, that's the scenario so far. But is the enactive argument this relevant, really relevant to the brain-bound view? I mean, is it relevant to challenge the brain-bound view? I think the enactive is here, at least in the literature that is available. Somehow they do the same. I mean, they mirror somehow the internalist failure to pay attention to the explanatory grounds of your rival position, okay? Because they were complaining that internalists were not really paying attention to the grounds that lead to the enactive view, but the enactivists really pay very little attention, if any, to the explanatory grounds that might be motivating the internalist view. So it looks like, if you don't do that, it looks like the brain-bound view, the orthodox view, is just taking a metaphysical commitment immediately at the entrance, okay? Which is not the case. When you analyze that, I think you see that this argument of the enactivist doesn't work. I mean, I try to show that. So my answer is no. It's not relevant really, this argument, because the argument ignores the explanatory grounds of the traditional science of consciousness. The argument really doesn't bring that framework and discuss this framework, which is the framework, which is the explanatory framework that grounds the traditional science of consciousness. Is the contrastive explanation. Okay, that I think is quite clear in the literature, in classical positions about consciousness, and also more contemporary position. It's all the guiding framework is the contrastive framework. Okay, and the point is that contrastive explanations allow to separate explanatory factors, disregarding whether or not they are unpluggable. The constructive explanatory framework is a way to deal with the problem of relevance in explanation, okay, and allows you to separate explanatory factors. But to do that, the framework really doesn't need to assume the separability in metaphysical terms of the components of the system that is being explained. So I think well, I'm going to try to show that demonstrating that neural and bodily factors are not unpluggable, which they demonstrate, okay, they succeed in doing that, leaves untouched, really. So it proves to be relevant to challenge the explanatory ground of the brain-bound view. That's the main point, at least for me here. So a few words about the explanatory framework, the contrastive. What's this? It's really quite simple and it's quite straightforward. Okay, in science, we want to answer constructive questions. Okay, we don't ask for why f, but rather why f rather than x something else. Okay. So this is a classical way to illustrate the framework. Why the frameworks, the contrast matters here. Okay, so you have the case of the thief that robbed a bank. He's in jail, and comes the priest, right, to make the thief to confess. So, and he asks, son, why did you rob the bank? And the thief answered, because that's where the money is. It's not the kind of answer that the priest was expecting, right? But why? That's because the contrast that he had in mind was completely different from the contrast that the thief was having in mind. Okay, the answer that you provide depends a lot of the contrast that you have in mind. Sometimes the contrast is not, as in this case, is not explicit, but you have a contrast. Okay, the priest was asking, why did you rob the bank, rather than not robbing at all? That was his question. But the question for the thief, what he understood was, why did you rob the bank, rather than the hospital or the school or whatever. Okay. So since they have different contrast to read the question, well, the answer is different. And in science, it's just a way to perform this kind of contrast in a more systematic, order, organized, controlled way. Okay, but the explanatory game is basically the same. And this is the kind of framework that guides traditional neuroscience of consciousness. This framework is a way to deal with the problem of explanatory relevance. So when we want to explain something, a phenomenon, we have almost infinite possibility of including factors that are present there in order to phenomenon to occur. Okay. But usually in science we are not gonna follow. We are going to track all the factors, all the elements that are present at that moment for the phenomenon to occur. We want to find something more specific. We want to delimit the explanatory the explanation. And so the contrast works for this purpose, okay? To help us to highlight what is going to be relevant, explanatory relevant for this, in the explanation. And the explanatory framework invites you to focus on the difference-making factor. Okay. So here, for example, you have two mobiles, and let's say one of them is not taking pictures properly, the pictures come blurry or any other problem, and you want to explain that, why the difference, okay? And you see that the mobiles, they have a lot of differences. For example, the color, one is white, the other one is black cases. This is bigger than this one, so there is another difference, and you can find a lot of differences. Okay, but the point here is to find the difference that makes the difference that is interesting for you in this moment. The difference that makes the difference with respect to the difference that you're observing, the phenomenon of interest, right? In this case, pictures. So you eventually, let's say you know nothing about the mobiles, okay? So let's say at the beginning you think that the color might be a reason, might be an important difference. You test and you realize that color really, they don't matter. Okay, you remove, and so on and so forth. You go checking, testing, until at some point eventually you find the difference making factor, let's say some micro device, electronic, inside the mobiles, and that's what finally is making the difference. Okay, and eventually you replace it, and then you solve the problem. Well, when you do that, you separate from the explanatory point of view the difference making factor from the background factors and the rest of the factors that are present there. Okay, and doing this, in doing this, really, you are not assuming that the background factors are not necessary for the normal working of the difference-making factor. So you know all the time that the rest of the, let's say, electronic device, micro devices, the wiring and the mobile, they are, of course, necessary at every moment for the difference-making factor. And you don't need to assume that the latter, the difference-making factor, can normally work unplugged from the former ones. That assumption doesn't play any role here in this frame. Okay? So here in the case of consciousness, you follow this framework. In traditional neuroscience, just take this contrastive analysis and ask questions like this, right? Why was Peter unconscious at 3 a.m. Okay, and now conscious at 9 p.m.? You make a contrast. Peter at this time, then Peter at this other time. You observe a difference, the difference that is important for you here, consciousness. Okay, and you want to compare to find the difference-making factor. You ask, what made the difference? You know there are a lot of things that are different here in these two situations, but you want to find the difference that makes the difference. Okay. Or, for example, why is a person in a coma unconscious rather than conscious? Again, you want to find the difference that makes the difference. And in the history of the neuroscience of consciousness, the science of consciousness, the observations, the evidence, okay, especially the clinical ones, they strongly suggest that the difference-making factor lies in the brain, whereas the body appears as a necessary, of course, necessary, but constant condition that can be treated as a background. That's the whole point, as far as I can see. So you have in one condition, the body from the physiological point of view working normally. Then the other condition, you still have the body working physiologically, normal condition. So the body here appears as a constant, okay, in both situations in terms of activity. And so it's a factor that you understand that is necessary the whole time for the brain to work, but it's a factor that is not showing you the difference regarding consciousness. And you refine the search, if not the body, what else might be in the body, and you iterate somehow this test you arrive to the brain as the difference making factor. Neuroscientists of consciousness have isolated the neural factors in explanatory terms from the bodily ones, not because they think they are unpluggable. They are not. They do that because that's what the constructive framework prescribes. You follow this constructive explanatory framework, and by doing this, you arrive to the brain has the best candidate, the difference making factor. And of course, you focus on that because you want to deal with the relevance explanatory problem. You don't want to deal with all the factors that have to be present there for consciousness. You focus on the difference making factor. So that's how neuroscience of consciousness or science of consciousness becomes neuroscience of consciousness. An important point, I think, is that the contrastive explanatory framework is neutral. Okay? Is neutral between brain-bound and enactive. The contrastive explanatory framework doesn't come with any commitment, internalist or externalist. It is the empirical evidence collected through the research guided by the framework, which grounds and motivates the brain-bound view. Okay. Because, of course, you want to find the difference-making factor, but the result is contingent, okay? You might have found that what was important was, let's say, the heart plus the liver plus the kidney, eventually. Or another possibility was actually that you find it was the whole body, maybe. Okay. So it's or a subset of systems, okay, in the body. But the framework has, as far as I can see, it doesn't come with any commitment, any metaphysical commitment at the entrance. Okay, it's neutral. So you arrive to an internalist brain-bound view just as testing, playing with the framework, okay, according to empirical evidence. So the brain-bound view is far from being a kind of immediate metaphysical commitment. It has an explanatory ground which motivates, okay, the metaphysical thesis of the brain-bound view. So you have explanatory reasons to think that the minimal realizing system for consciousness is the brain. Why? Because you find with this framework that the brain is the difference-making factor. That's the motivation, I think. Well, but I think that you can take a part of the analysis of the enactive analysis. Okay, it's just that I think the enactive argument as an argument to challenge and to force us somehow to make a choice and to abandon the brain-bound view, traditional neuroscience, to take the enactive path. I think that's what fails, but there is an interesting message that comes with the enactive analysis, and I think we might reformulate this, okay? And it's something like this. If you want to talk about a more complete explanation, okay, you might say that the more complete an explanation, the more you understand the phenomenon. Okay, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So you want to understand consciousness. Let's say, well, let's say we assume, well, the brain is very important, it's central. We might say it is the minimal realizing system for consciousness, the brain. Yeah, but I want more. I want to understand how the brain, for example, is fed by the rest of the system, how the brain coordinates, how the brain is plugged, is connected to the rest of this system. Fine. Yeah, that helps. So let's study how the brain, okay, is connected to the rest of the body. If you want more, well, you might go on asking, but let's go on. The body, for sure, it needs some connection, some coordination with the environment, hydration, water, some kind of atmosphere, some niche conditions. Okay. Well, yeah. Or if you want to expand and extend, and you want to have the whole picture, wider picture, I think that helps to understand, and you can have a more complete explanation. That's okay. But that's something different, okay? You might say, if we want a more complete explanation of consciousness, then the brain seems not to be enough. Fair enough. We need to include the body and perhaps extra bodily factors. Fair enough. That's okay. However, I think this doesn't mean we have to include the body as a part of the minimal realization base of consciousness. So the epistemic benefit of a more complete explanation doesn't necessarily translate into a metaphysical thesis. I think this is a step that is problematic in the enactive view, according to this argument. Okay. You don't need to take that step. I think there is no strong reason to take that step. You may take the enactive message in these terms as inviting to a more complete explanation. Okay. But it doesn't follow from that you have to include the body as the minimal realizing system for consciousness, the direct substrate of consciousness. So perhaps it's not this discussion is not about brain-bound versus enactive, as the enactive present the choice again, but rather about brain-bound along with enactive. There is room to preserve, right, the neurocentric or brain-bound position, which now we understand it has some explanatory ground. It doesn't come unmotivated. Okay, it has a motivation, some research program. You can keep that, and you can add the enactive message as a complement, as a call for a more complete explanation. I think that's a way in which you can coordinate and kind of cultivate a dialogue between these two programs, and not a kind of choice, disjunctive a choice between these two programs. So finally, for the conclusions, well, the enactive argument, the brain and body are not unpluggable. I think in this case, it proves to be relevant to challenge the explanatory ground of the brain-bound view. Okay. The brain-bound view derives from the evidence accumulated in neuroscientific research guided by the contrastive explanatory framework, which allows to separate explanatory factors without assuming they are unpluggable. Okay. That assumption is not a part of the game. There might be other, you have to leave open the door here, there might be other independent, legitimate reasons to prefer enactive to brain-bound still, okay? But the ones provided through this line of argument, I think, don't work. I mean, this line of argument, I think, is not working. So the activists, if they want to, I think, if they want to really push the choice, well, more arguments and different arguments are needed, I think. But in my view, an activist might want to reformulate the argument in strictly epistemic terms, okay, without going metaphysical. It might be something like, okay, a more complete explanation of consciousness requires to include the body. And traditional neuroscience and internalists, I think, would and should agree with this. There shouldn't be any problem with this. And in that way, I think you might get these two views working somehow together, if that is possible. And that's it. Okay, thank you very much.